Hello, my dear friends. You're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 21st of November. Today we have some updates, so let's start. First, we're going to start with the Russian sources map. They gave us a few updates on this map. But before we start, I would like to say that both parties, the Russians and the Ukrainians, are saying that they can't do any active actions on the front lines because of the weather. At least if we're talking about the south of Ukraine, about Zaporozhye or Kherson district or South Donetsk district, it's very there are a lot of rain and the weather is so bad, so nobody can use armored vehicles. The only type of vehicles the parties are able to use is tanks. And if we're talking about uh, some armored vehicles, highly unlikely that it's possible to cross these fields during this rainy weather. But anyway, if we're talking about Kherson district, the Ukrainians, according to the Russian sources, sent some commandos in this area trying to cross the Dnieper River or to get as close as possible to the towns by the name of Gola Pristan. We discussed this area many times, and if you remember, I told you that if the Ukrainians started any offensive operation on this bank of the river, first they need to take or to establish fire control over the crosses near Gola Pristan town and near Oleshki. And as you can see, the Ukrainians tried to cross to send some commandos in the area of Gola Pristan, but the Russians spotted them, and according to the Russian information, they destroyed these commandos, but they didn't provide us any number about their losses of the Ukrainians in this area. If we are talking about Zaporozhye area, the picture is the same. The Ukrainians continue attacking Energodar, continue shelling this power plant, nuclear power plant. And today we got more and more Ukrainian authority sources confirms that the Ukrainians are ready to start negotiation process, but only as soon as the Russians demilitarize the Energodar and Zaporozhye power plant and move their forces out of this town, and let's say give control to this town to the Ukrainians. We discussed the situation many times, and the Russians understand if they do this, yes, maybe this war will be stopped, and the Ukrainians will confirm the territories that the Russians could control over, like Zaporozhye, Kherson, and so on. But the thing is that in this case, the Ukrainians will be able to use this nuclear power plant as some kind of dirty bomb and some kind of if the Russians ever start this war again, the Ukrainians will be able to destroy or to blow up this power plant, and of course, this explosion will reduce and will pollute the territory all over the south of Ukraine, including Crimea. So the Russians understand that they can't sign any papers like this, and the only one way is to force with the power Zelensky authorities to sign peace agreement. If we're talking about Gulyai-Polye Orekhov, we got completely different opposite information from both sides. But the thing is that the Russians are saying that Ukrainians accumulate forces in near Orekhov and Gulyai-Polye. The Ukrainians are saying that the Russians accumulate forces on the area between Vasilievka, Tokmak, and Kamyanka, so on this line. So we can say that both parties accumulate forces in front of each other, and maybe we are going to see as soon as the temperature of the will be below the 0 degree 0 on Celsius, and maybe at this very moment we are going to see some battle on this front line. But for now, the Russians are saying that Ukrainians are slowed down in this area. It's very difficult for them to move supply and support in this area, and because of the fact that they're very slow, they need to accumulate their forces very far from the front line, something around 40-50 kilometers from Orekhov, from Gulyai-Polye, if we're talking about artillery system and so on. Why is that? Because as you know, the Russians signed a lot of documents, a lot of contracts with Iran, and starting from July, according to the Western sources, the Russians managed to establish at least maybe 2 or 3 plants of drone producing, and now they are ready to build up to some few hundreds or maybe up to 100 drones per month of their own production. And this is the reason. And as you know, maybe you heard about the latest version of drone by the name of Lancet number 3. This is very powerful, like we can say, rocket or missile, or like I don't know, controlled shell. I don't know how to call this, but the Ukrainians are afraid of this system and they can't keep their forces on the front line. They need to accumulate, but they are slowed down because of the fact that they need to move a lot of forces from Kherson, and we discussed this, that it's very difficult to cross Dnieper River with the problems the Ukrainians have. So for now, the Ukrainians are not ready to start anything in Zaporozhye front line. If we are talking about, let's say, the front line between Vremivka and Ugledar, if we're talking about Ugledar battle, today we got some updates from the Russians. They said that during the previous 24 hours there were very heavy clashes in the area between Novodarivka. This one, the Ukrainians were attacking in this area. Near Novomikhailivka, the Ukrainians were trying to return back positions that they lost during the previous weeks of clashes in this area. Near Vladimirovka, and near Pavlovka. So the Ukrainians were attacking all along the front line. I can't say that that was a real attacks, because as a result of those attacks, the Ukraine lost something around 70 soldiers, up to 13 armored vehicles, including just regular cars and so on. So the losses are not so big. But if we're talking about the Russians, during the previous hours, days, we got a lot of updates. We saw, I believe you saw maybe in the videos, a lot of videos from the Pavlovka bridgehead, where the Russians were attacking the Ukrainians, and I mentioned one important thing, that the Russians have changed their destination, their direction, to be more precise. So if we take a look at this map, we see that this map shows that towns like Blagodatne, Vladimirovka, Mykolaiv, Pavlovka is under Ukrainian control, Solotka as well. But to tell the truth, these towns is under Russian control, and at least the Russian sources map and deployment map confirms this information, that these towns is under Russian control. So we're talking a lot about Ugledar battle, that the Russians there is like not much ways how to attack this town in front, but it's very difficult, and the Russians will have a lot of losses in this case, or to attack in direction of Vadiana. But in this case, they need to cross a lot of fields. All these fields are mines, so it's also there are going to be a lot of losses. So I'm not sure if that the Russians are doing right now is the real solution. Maybe some kind of false attack, or some kind of just to do something, but not to stand at their position. But the Russians started their movement to the west in direction of Prichistovka. And these days, there were a lot of updates. The fact that the Russians were fighting in this area on the road, somewhere in the middle between Prichistovka and Pavlovka, in this area. They were attacking the Ukrainian commandos, they were attacking the Ukrainian scouts, there were videos of the retreat Ukrainian forces from this area. So we can say that the Russians, before continuing attack in direction of Vuhledar, decided to move a little bit to the west. And if we try to analyze the area on the west from Pavlovka, there are at least three important things in this area. First of all, there is an airport. As you can see, this airport is not so big anyway, but anyway, this is the area where the Russians are able to establish some kind of checkpoint, or to establish let's say some trenches, fortifications. And if we take a look a little bit to the northeast, there is an industrial zone in this area, and this area is very nice place to establish, let's say, fortifications or bridgehead to develop the further offensive operation in this area. So as I understand, the Russians first of all want to cross the river Kashlygach, let's say somewhere in the middle between Prichistovka and Ugledar, somewhere here. The distance between Prichistovka and this area is around 6 kilometers, and from Ugledar's almost the same range, around 6 kilometers. It's not very far. The Ukrainians are able to attack this area with artillery, with mortar system and so on, but anyway they don't have a real fire control, or eye control over this position. Even if they send drones, these days the weather is very bad, and as we discussed in the beginning, and the thing is that both sides are saying that it's very difficult to use drones in this situation, because or if you don't want to lose your drone, you need to fly on the very high, and it's very difficult because of fog, because of clouds and so on. So that's why you need to use your drone on the very low height from the ground, and in this case your enemy are able to shut down a drone. So if we're talking about this perspective, yes, we can say that this is the best time for the Russians to do any offensive operation, because the enemy can't see your forces, and the distance between the Russians' position in Pavlovka and this bridgehead is not so big. So yes, there is chances for the Russians to cross Kashlygach in this area and to establish position something like this on this side of the river. Furthermore, there is, as we discussed, industrial zone, airport, and the most important, that this bridgehead is located on that side of the river. And from this area, as you can see, there are three towns around this bridgehead. First of all, Prichistovka, on the north Novoukrainka, and on the east Ugledar. And the distance to all these towns is almost the same, 5-6 kilometers, and if we're talking about Novoukranovka, a little bit more. But anyway, from this position during the winter, during the bad weather situation, the Russians are able to build at least trenches, fortification, and to have some bridgehead on this side of Kashlygach. And from this side, the Russians from this area will be able to develop or to establish some fire control over the road that connects Novoukrainka and Prichistovka. And of course, to establish fire control over the road that connects Bogoyavlenka and Ugledar. Of course, there are more roads that connects Ugledar, but if we're talking about Prichistovka, this is the only road that connects, let's say, main big land with Prichistovka. There is a road that connects Prichistovka and Zolotaya Niva, that located on the west from Prichistovka. But I believe, and if we take a look at the Russian sources map, you're gonna see that these towns like Novodonetsk, Novomayorsk is under Russian control. So the Russians, I believe, do have possibilities to cut this road as well. Furthermore, if the Ukrainians uses this road, they can support their forces from Velika Novoselovka, maybe from Shakhterska. So anyway, if the Russians can establish some bridgehead on this side of the river somewhere here, they will be able to pin down the Ukrainians, and they will be able to develop their offensive operation in direction of Prichistovka. And if we're talking about strategic perspective, there is no value of this town. But if we're talking about tactical, of course, it might bring them some points. And from Prichistovka, of course, the Russians will be able to develop their offensive operation in direction of Velika Novoselovka, Novoukrainka, or to take control over this entire area, and then to think what to do with Novoukrainka, and maybe to try to encircle Ugledar using the wider hook or something like this. But for now, because of bad weather, maybe just some kind of speculations. Very difficult to understand what the Ukrainians or the Russians are able to do during this bad weather period of time. Now let's move to the north, to Donetsk, and as you can see today we got a lot of updates from Marinka. We see a lot of icons, but to tell the truth, it doesn't mean that there are a lot of events or some kind of breaking events or something like this. This icon shows that the Russian source map has been updated. Today we got some confirmation from the ground that the Russians managed to, let's take a look at this map, to cross another 2 or 3 straits in direction of the west part of Marinka. They managed to connect their position from the north to the south. As you can see, there is a river that split this Marinka into parts. So they control, the Russians these days establish control over something like this, nothing more. Not much, but if we're talking about this Verdun line in Marinka, I believe this is a very great success. The only question is, what price did the Russian pay for these streets and these square meters? I hope that the value and the square meters worth the losses they had. So, but as you can see from the Ukrainian side, they are still there. They are not planning to give up. They are not planning to retreat. They are ready to fight with the Russians and then stand. If the Ukrainians lose Marinka, then the Russians will be able to continue development of their operation in direction of Georgievka, Pobeda, and the entire front line might be collapsed because of fall of the Marinka. If we're talking about Pesky, no updates from this area. The Russians show some updates about the battle for Pervomaiska, but they stuck a little bit. They can't continue their attack. And the problem is that the Ukrainians have possibility to send their tanks between these two residential areas. This territory is not mined, and the Ukrainians are able to send their tanks here, right in front, and to attack the Russians from this area in direction of this bridge and so on. The Russians can't attack the Ukrainians into flank, and even if they do this, anyway, there is a residential territory barrier, and they can't attack the Ukrainians' tanks in their back, in their flank, and to attack the tanks in front. Sometimes it's like the waste of weapon or rockets. So the Ukrainians have possibility to pin down the Russians, to slow them down, and not to allow them to develop their offensive operation in direction of Pervomaisk and Nitailova. So the progress is not big from the Russians. The Russians tries to attack and to storm Nivoyska. There are no more updates about this town. This week they managed to take control over this fortification. I believe that now they're trying to storm these two lines, and maybe this somewhere in the Thursday or maybe in the Wednesday or Friday we're going to receive that the Russians got control over another line of fortification, and they will get as close as possible to Nivoyska. Very slow, very difficult, but they don't have any other option. The only one thing they can do in this case is try to reduce their losses, and that's it that they can do. If we're talking about Avdiivka, no updates from this town. Donetsk is under very heavy fire as it was yesterday and the day before. If we're talking about Toretsk, New York agglomeration, there are no changes. The same situation, artillery duels, nothing more. If we're talking about Bakhmut, there are heavy clashes on the ground. The Wagner forces storms this town, trying to push the Ukrainians from this area, trying to attack in direction of Klishchevka, Andreevka, Kurdyumovka, Zaryanovka. But for now, as you can see, this map is not updated. I believe that by the end of this week, we are going to see some updates because the Ukrainian brigades in this area are had a lot of losses. They have a lot of losses, and sooner or later some of them will be I don't know, maybe reduced and will be forced to step back from the front lines, from the battle line. If we're talking about Liman area, Seversk area, the same situation, the same story. The Ukrainians made another attempt, but that wasn't even a real attack because the Russians reported that as a result of clashes on Liman front line, the Ukraine lost just 20 soldiers and something around 4 armored vehicles. So as you can see, not much on this front line, and maybe these 20 includes wounded. So I believe that maybe their real losses we are talking about killed is not more than 5 commandos or scouts in this area. The same situation from the north. The Ukrainians made another attempt to cross this railroad, trying to attack Kuzyumovka, but they couldn't do this. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukraine lost around 35 soldiers and something around 6 armored vehicles. So as you can see as well, the losses are very slow because of weather, because of very difficult in using of drones, and we understand that drones sometimes can change the situation on the front line. If you have stormtroopers who storm the enemy position, it's a very bad idea to send your soldiers without support with the drones who can send exactly where your enemy, which building is filled with the enemy, and so on. And because of bad weather, both parties decided to wait a little bit because I believe that just 1 or 2 weeks left before the real winter comes to this area, and after that maybe we are going to see some changes on the front line. Furthermore, if you remember, Zelensky promised that he is going to have some rest in Crimea in January of the next year. So we can say that less than in 2 months with a half, Zelensky is going to visit Crimea. So that means that he's planning to do something during the winter campaign. Furthermore, today the Institute of Study of War reported that army from Belarus are ready to join the war in Ukraine, let's say in a moment. So just give them an order and this army are ready to cross the border and to enter the north part of Ukraine, northwest or northeast. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.